Hi.
Hi, how are you
Hi.
doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
So I'll just mute while everybody comes in, and then we'll start normally just a minute or so after one our time. Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, welcome everybody to Queer Politics webinar number 7. You should be able to hear me, and soon we'll be able to hear Tarek in Lebanon. It's around about 8 o'clock in the evening for him, so thank you for joining us this early part of the evening. Really appreciate everybody turning out for today's session. I wanted to let you know that there have been obviously significant economic and social upheavals in Lebanon. Tarek has told me that there's a possibility of power cuts. And if a power cut happens, then as many of you will have experienced, a generator will kick in, but we may have a few minutes of downtime, which I will attempt to fill with some song or dance or juggling or some other entertainment for you until Tarek rejoins us from Lebanon, if that happens. Just to remind you, if you haven't been on this webinar before, we aim for about an hour, keep it short and sweet. I'm gonna have a conversation with Tarek and pose some questions to him about Lebanon, the Arab world, political and economic and social dynamics, and queer LGBTQI politics in the region and in his country. And then I would love for a conversation to begin between all of you and Tarek about the Middle East, about LGBTQ people in the Arab world, and anything else you'd like to discuss. So as usual, please just send me a little note on the chat saying you'd like to be on the question list. Don't have to tell me your question, and then I'll introduce you, keep a list of questioners, and you can speak directly either over audio or audio and video to Tarek. So without further ado, I should introduce, many of you will know that Tarek Zeidan is one of the most prominent and important activists and advocates and scholars of queer politics in the Middle East and the Arab world. I met Tarek a number of years ago now in Beirut when I believe he was still technically with Carnegie, but was starting to be involved with setting up and re-energizing the group that he's now the executive director of, Helem. But in those intervening period, Tarek returned to the States to do a degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He'd already done work at Tufts, at the Fletcher School at Tufts, and has, I think, demonstrated how learning some of the methodologies and patterns and skills in the West, and then taking them back and applying them in a nuanced and culturally appropriate way in the Middle East is one of the best things that I think American and European education can assist with. Obviously, we are in a place, and Lebanon is in a place of great social and economic upheaval, massive protests, economic collapse, and social turmoil. And that's something that I think would be really interesting to start with. Getting Tarek's opinion and narration of what is happening in Beirut and Lebanon today, and especially how the upheaval is affecting queer people, Lebanese LGBTQ people, especially specifically, and how his work is being impacted by the social struggles there. So over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and especially thank you for that very generous introduction. As Andrew said, my name is Tarek Zeidan, and I have the privilege and honor to be the executive director of Helem, an organization that people working on gender and sexuality, or just human rights in general, in the Middle East and North Africa region might have heard of. It's the first LGBT rights organization ever founded and formed in the Arab world in 2001 in Beirut, Lebanon. And as Andrew mentioned, I came back after being involved with it as a youth around 2013, and sort of resumed the task of revitalizing it and changing it. and sort of adapting it to the new challenges and sort of geopolitical realities that we were facing in Lebanon. And I've been back from my master's for 2 years now. And unfortunately, things took a turn to the unexpected 2 years into my directorship of the organization. As Andrew mentioned, Lebanon has been going through a really difficult, almost monumental economic and political crisis. This the beginnings of this have been simmering for quite a while, and it finally exploded on October 17, 2019, in what became known as the Beirut Revolution. And I want to stop a little bit on that particular event as it relates to LGBT and queer mobilizing, as well as LGBT rights in the country and in the region. Those following the protests would have noticed that there was an unprecedented visibility, not just to women participating in this revolution, but also for queer communities that were very visible and very much part of the protesting masses down in Revolutionary Square. Helem at the time recognized that this was a very fundamental moment in Lebanese history, and very quickly decided to do all that it could in order to facilitate the participation of LGBT people within this revolution. I'm not going to go into too many details. I will share with you maybe some observations which you might find, or which I found very interesting. One, it seemed that women and queer people were not only very visible in this movement, but it seemed that men in general were largely either the antagonist of this revolution or much, much less visible than these previously unseen populations. And in many ways, I describe the October 17 revolution as Lebanon's first gay pride parade. And it's because it was the first time that people actually paraded on the street politically. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't a sit-in, which is something that we've done for a very long time. It was full-on community mobilization. And that was really significant because pride all over the world is now increasingly coming under scrutiny for becoming too corporatized and too sort of losing touch with its sort of revolutionary roots. And just as the Reclaim Pride movement got off on the 50th anniversary of Stonewall in New York City, I could see, which I marched in, I could feel the same vibe as we were protesting in Beirut in October. What was also interesting was that this mobilization of the community was not around LGBT rights specifically. It was not around civil and political rights, not around decriminalization. It was very much around anti-corruption. It was around jobs. It was around accountability from the government. And it centered economic and social rights as opposed to civil and political rights, something that I didn't think would happen in that quickly and that decisively in the movement in Lebanon. So it really raised a lot of questions as to what does the trajectory of liberation for LGBT people look like in the Arab world, in the post-colonial Arab world, in the global South in general, but particularly in this part of the world where this issue has been incredibly contentious and unfortunately not very well researched, and not a lot of information is available on queer communities living and existing and resisting and advocating in this part of the world. So that moment was also incredibly important because in my understanding, or at least I would like to think so, that it was the first time that a new public narrative in Lebanon, a secular public narrative, was introduced. Lebanon is a very diverse place. It has a lot of sectarian groups, a lot of ethnic groups, and each and every single one of them has a particular public narrative of what Lebanon is and what it means to be Lebanese. And that's almost always very firmly rooted in sectarian or political party narratives. And this was a very secular, diverse, open, it looked like a Lebanon that I wanted to be a part of. And unfortunately, now looking back, it didn't take the dramatic and decisive routes that I hoped it would take, perhaps naively, but it did introduce something new, and it did show us just how many people in Lebanon were very ready to subscribe to this new public narrative. Unfortunately, the economic situation deteriorated really quickly, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting lockdowns did nothing but exacerbate the situation. And we find ourselves now in really a moment of stagnation when it comes to continuing what the revolution promised. And it's a very bleak outlook. And the community that had been so incredibly vibrant and so visible and a part of the revolutionary masses in the sort of fourth quarter of 2019 has really been exhausted and been plagued with a lot of challenges that had been, not really on top of our priority earlier. And I could, name them all, but right now as a community, we're struggling with food insecurity, massive unemployment, complete access to healthcare. And by healthcare, I don't just mean sexually transmitted infections. If you ask people in the community what healthcare they need, they'll tell you diabetes, hypertension, heart problems. This is what the community actually needs. There's plenty of funding for STIs, trust me. And what we noticed around the world, which is the spike in incidents of domestic violence for women, was also true for the queer community. Many individuals were forced to go back to live with family for the lockdown or back to their ancestral villages, which not only drove up domestic violence count, but also drove up the incidents of people calling in Helem's hotline, experiencing depression, suicidal ideation. Mental health is, I would categorize as a catastrophe in Lebanon for the queer community at the moment. And so, I don't know, Andrew, if this is me going way too deep into the analysis, but for us as an organization, it caused us a bit of strategic whiplash in terms of what is our role in supporting this community. And if later I was asked to speak a little bit about what Helem does, but our fundamental vision, our driving force is to protect and empower this community, to mobilize the community for long-term liberation. And how can you do that if there is no community? And how can you leverage the power of mobilization when you're dealing with a virus that precisely works against that form of power building, bringing people together physically in order to build power? So I think as an organization, especially since we're the only organization that has a non-commercial public space for queer people in a country and in a region where public spaces are incredibly rare and not safe, the question has emerged as to how do we think about liberation and empowerment? Are we engaging more and more with the human rights framework, or are we engaging more with the development framework? What is our role in order to build power in this community? And what are the avenues that we should follow? Andrew, I'll end this segment with a little bit of a comment which you said concerning Western education, and you're absolutely right. I've been incredibly privileged to study really nuanced, strategic sort of approaches for human rights advocacy in my graduate studies, and have taken the time to really read about the trajectory of the LGBT rights movement in the West. And so I came back with all of these diagnostic tools to Lebanon, and I am both sad and happy to report that I had to unlearn everything because the one lesson that I did learn was that we need to question every single one of the assumptions that we had in terms of what made the LGBT rights movement so successful in the United States, crowned most recently by the SCOTUS decision to ban any discrimination at the workplace. So I'll stop there and let you.
That's fabulous. And I want to go back a little bit to 2019 and that Lebanon that you could see was somewhere you wanted to live in, and then going forward to today to unpack a little bit of what you've said. Also, just briefly reminded me when you said about relearning. My experience as a a 23-year-old young Londoner, white Londoner, who had become really obsessed with South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement. And from 18 to 23, had done all my anti-apartheid stuff in 1980s London, and finally got the chance to go to South Africa and arrived there. Mandela had just been released. I arrived a month after Mandela had been released, thinking I knew everything about Africa, and I knew everything about South Africa. And I stepped off that plane and I immediately realized I hadn't a clue about anything. And I spent years relearning piece by piece and never really understood, but just being there, just trying to gain purchase on something that you'd read all about, but suddenly were there. That's a huge thing for, I think, every student to go and experience in depth. But as I said, I wanted to take you back to 2019. It seems to me at these euphoric moments of popular uprising, when it comes to the queer world, a couple of things have happened in the modern period. In Latin America, a lot of uprisings about human rights sort of incorporated sexual orientation and gender identity as one of those rights in a basket of rights. And they sort of were coattailed in Guatemala or Colombia or places where there was change. The progressives woke up to queer rights and included them as a raft of what should be done. But in, say, Zimbabwe, when there's an uprising, a dictator says, oh, let's find the right scapegoats. The scapegoats are the queers. The Zimbabwean queers must be doing this, ruining us at the behest of their British overlords and bringing their gayness to us. Now, was there a feeling a year ago of backlash or sudden intersectionality? Suddenly the progressives saw queer rights as part of their basket, or did the state suddenly see the LGBTQ issue as the area they could focus on as backlash?
That's a really, really important question to ask in the region. And I think Egypt is one of the best places to look at in order to answer that question, in addition to Lebanon. And you're right, using queer bodies, queer lives, queer experiences has long been a very effective, not just scapegoat, but sort of distraction in order to either overtake media coverage at a certain moment in time. In fact, last year I was invited to speak at the Thomson Reuters conference, and I did a speech exactly comparing incidents of when mass arrests happened in Egypt for LGBT people and the massive media coverage, and when approximately at the same time there would be more than 52 Islamists being beheaded, or a very controversial policy or law being enacted. And it was surreal if you follow the timelines on how congruent they were. Now, in the Lebanese case, there was a study that I did in 2015 with some colleagues of mine at the Arab Foundation for Freedom and Equality. And it was the first study actually measuring attitudes towards LGBT people by interviewing more than 1,000 Lebanese individuals. And this was done by Ipsos. So it was purposefully done by the company that the Lebanese parliament uses to get all of its statistics, so that we wouldn't be accused of fabricating the results. And surprisingly, we found that 34% of the Lebanese population does not believe that LGBT people should be criminalized. Obviously, there were a lot more nuanced questions in the questionnaire, but that in itself just shows you just how far we are in Lebanon in terms of being part of the public consciousness, and in terms of having countered homophobia and transphobia with knowledge, and countering the mythologies has largely been very effective, especially with the advent of alternative media and social media. A place like the Middle East, if you're looking at traditional media as a source of information, you will sadly not be getting the accurate picture of where people stand and where people are. And so using LGBT people as a scapegoat in a place like Lebanon has had increasingly diminishing rate of return. And so it has largely been abandoned by many political parties, including the most conservative ones. Even when I don't know if you're familiar with the Mashru' Layla incident that happened a few months before the revolution actually broke out. And it was targeted against, their lead singer, Hamid Sinno, who is openly gay. His status as a member of the LGBT community was not really the focus or the engine behind the campaign that was orchestrated against him by, Christian conservatives in Lebanon. It was the fact that he put up a photo of Madonna, the singer, superimposed on an icon of Madonna, the religious figure. So in a place like Lebanon, those tactics seem to be working less and less. And within the context of revolution, we found out that that was actually true on the ground. Two things really struck me during the protests, which lasted for 2 months. One, Helem's tent was smack in the middle of the revolutionary square, rainbow colors and all. And it was very, very clear that people who were gender non-conforming, people who did not look normative were congregating there, and we did not have one single incident of harassment or of anybody coming to us for protection the entire time. Does that mean there's no harassment on the street? And does that mean that Lebanon is a safe place? No. But does that mean that at that moment in time, queer people were accepted as part of this movement on the ground? I would argue that yes, this was very clearly the case. The second was how loud and how prominent LGBT people were in chanting and putting up slogans and actually writing and sort of creating graffiti and art all over the streets of the city, and how that art became the sort of the most emblematic of the revolution. And whenever some of the revolutionaries would be chanting homophobic chants against the political elite in Lebanon, you'd hear counter chants from feminist groups, from LGBT groups, from leftist groups, correcting them and saying, no, you can't use this as a slur. And then you'd see people catching on, and then gradually you stopped hearing these sort of misogynistic and homophobic, transphobic chants in the street. Now, this is a very, this was a moment in space and time that was quite insulated. But again, it showed you what the possibilities were. It showed you who exactly you were sharing a country with. And we as, Lebanese progressives, or whatever you want to call us, had been feeling a sense of isolation for a very long time. Me and my friends thought we were literally the only 10 people who thought the way we did, who thought that we wanted to get rid of all of the political elite, we wanted to get rid of the sectarian system. And then all of a sudden we found out, oh crap, we're not the only people that think this way. And it was a very special moment. I wish that I could, save it to go back to it at some point, but it showed you what could have been or could still be if we play our cards right.
And to what extent are you worried that that's a false door? That even if there is radical political change at the highest levels in the Lebanese political system, new incumbents will still relegate queer issues to a point where they're not central to change in the country? I mean, are you scared that that window of opportunity is perhaps closing and won't be seen in the near future?
It is a concern, but I don't see history as linear. I see it as cyclical. And the experience of many of our colleagues and friends and siblings who are LGBTQ activists in the global north and in the West now can attest to the fact that there always is a chance that things might change. If you look at Hungary and Poland and arguably the United States, you'd see that, I always go back to what, one of the things that I learned from Angela Davis was that you can never ever put your suitcase down. There will always be somebody trying to take your rights away. You have to constantly fight. And in a place like Lebanon, actually, there have been hints that there is not a false dawn, but sort of a crack in the armor which we can exploit and push forward on the political front. So many members of parliament, nowhere near the needed 51%, have been more vocal about accepting LGBT people and saying, let's decrim, let's live and let live. And this isn't necessarily because there's a political change. Let's not forget Lebanon is a country that is constantly at cause at effect and never at cause. Lebanese politics are negotiated in Washington, Brussels, Tehran, and Riyadh. They're not negotiated in Beirut.
And Damascus.
And Damascus as well. Well, yeah, but Damascus and Tehran, I guess, would be on the same side of the negotiating table most of the time. And the presence of the international community, the fact that so many Lebanese politicians and their political projects are very reliant on external support, external funding, diplomatic presence in Lebanon, these were all things that we have from the beginning used to our advantage and try to leverage in order to create spaces where people can either be safe, or we can push the envelope more, or become more visible, and try to, as much as possible, enter new places, enter new conversations, and start degrading these mythologies that have been present for centuries and erode them even further. So I'm not necessarily pessimistic. What I am pessimistic about is the fact that these so-called progressives, people that are educated, people that are more likely to accept diversity, are leaving. The brain drain has been one of Lebanon's Achilles heels since forever. And the socioeconomic situation is now leading to very serious concerns about what this country looks like in terms of educational infrastructure, when it comes to health infrastructure. When you've got a state that is collapsing, I mean, Lebanon, you can argue, has always been a failed state, but now that it's a collapsing state, you worry about everybody. You don't just worry about LGBT people, you worry about the refugees, you worry about migrant workers, you worry about women, you worry about everybody. And that's where we are now. We're now looking and seeing, where does this spiral gonna end? What is Lebanon gonna look like? And how can we adapt, and how can we survive until things plateau or stabilize, and hopefully stabilize in a way that will allow us to continue our work and not lose the past 2 decades of progress that we've had.
I'm going to ask you one more question and then take the first audience question. As you're aware, an Arab-Israeli member of parliament sort of just spoke about how there were no gays in the Arab world. Even if they were appropriately hiding. I wonder about the level of allyship, not just in the West, but in the Arab world for you. You are by far the most prominent civil society, institutional queer group in the Arab world. Are you seeing a change in the allies from other Arab world countries? Or are you seeing that language from the Arab-Israeli MP, Wahid Taha, who basically dismissed it as an issue? Where are we on that needle?
Well, I believe that the statements of the MP were done within the context of a bill that was being introduced to ban conversion therapy. So it was very particularly contextualized in that debate going on over there. And I'm always very hesitant in sort of commenting on particularly issues that take place in Israel and Palestine, because they can very easily be seen as, any sort of condemnation can be used politically, and any sort of silence can also be used politically. But I can say this, and saying that I hope we're at a place whereby we can actually critique what anybody says without being accused of, supporting any pinkwashing agenda, which is something that Helem has long stood in direct contrast to since its beginning. But I will say this. Obviously, the MP is not alone. There are other MPs and other people sort of political elites all over the region that say the exact same thing, that say LGBT people don't exist, or if they do, they should be hiding, and if they're not, and if they should be cured or brought back to normal. And again, if you were to look at traditional media outlets throughout the region, you might think that this is right. But then you forget that all media is politicized and controlled. And if you look at social media and alternative media, you would see that the conversation around gender and sexuality and LGBT people is raging. Now, it depends on what you think of as progress. And I would particularly like to highlight the incident of the death of Sarah Hijazi, who's queer communist and woman activist from Egypt, who sadly ended her life in exile because she couldn't go back. And a lot of people have looked at that incident at first, and I myself included, as a monumental event in the history of the LGBT movement in the Arab world. We can talk a lot about the significance of what it means to be an atheist, communist, queer woman from Egypt, and what it means to end your own life, particularly, and the experience of dying as something that is very linked to what it means to be queer in the Arab world. But I can tell you that this woman's death has sparked a conversation on LGBT issues on almost every single dinner table throughout, not just Egypt, but throughout the region. And that, as bleak as that looks, and if you look at I firmly believe that the worst of humanity lies in the comment section of YouTube and Facebook. And so if you look at the comments there, your heart sinks, because you cannot believe the amount of hatred and the amount of just horror that people have. But if you think strategically, you're like, no, this woman actually forced people to talk about her. She actually did something that activists have not been able to do for decades, which is to force this conversation, to say, we are here. You can think whatever you want, but you can't deny our presence, and you can't deny that we're part of the fabric of the society. So are you going to engage in this conversation, or are you going to hide behind your finger and act like we don't exist? And so that, to me, in my strategic head, is a form of progress, as painful and as devastating as it was.
Absolutely. And in a way, it sort of reminded me of the death in Sidi Bouez in Tunisia that sparked really the Arab Spring of 2011. I mean, a moment in time, an individual that just caught the imagination, in many ways, the most difficult imagination of people, and just drove them on. Let me take Rola Abisamra, who has a question, I think, about Helem and its constituency.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. I'm really appreciating hearing you talking about this, especially from a strategic place and your analytic place, because I'm an organizer here in Atlanta, and also because I'm a queer daughter of Lebanese immigrants to the US, and I am just so happy to hear your voice. So if it can be permitted, I have two questions. Thank you. And the first one is, what are the demographics of Helem's community members, those who call you for support or who come to your space or with whom you organize? And I'm especially interested in maybe gender, age, and national origin and immigration status. And then also, like, what part of the LGBTQIA alphabet do they identify as? And also, in your view, how does class and income interact with queer people's freedoms or lack thereof? I'll ask the second question if you have time. It's more of a strategic question or a movement building question, but I'd love to know who are your closest political allies in Lebanon, and especially with the feminist activists, what overlaps do you have and how do you fight for each other?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Andrew, would you like me to answer all of those, or would you like me to take several questions and then answer everything? How do you?
Yes, you answer those and then we move on to the next one. So take your time.
Thank you, Rilla, very much. It's also very good to hear your voice and to hear that you're organizing on the other side of the pond. So Helem as a community space has, before the lockdown, obviously, had approximately 500 visitors each week. So it's a very busy place. And in terms of our demographics, we're a membership-based organization. So I've got statistics based on membership. But in general, we tend to, right now, in terms of Helem's membership, it's when it comes to gender identity, it's almost 30% trans-identifying, and sort of whether it's trans or non-binary or agendered folks. In terms of age, we've got people in our youth group that are as young as 12, and people as old as 52 or 53 that also happen to be part of our staff. In terms of national origin, approximately also like 25 to 30% of our membership are refugees and Syrian immigrants, many of whom are waiting in Lebanon for resettlement because they're considered very highly vulnerable. But because our space values diversity and sees it as a form of power, we constantly integrate new communities. So one of the elected members of the board of Helem is actually reserved for a non-Lebanese person in order to guarantee that those voices are in the decision-making table. And the influx of refugees into Lebanon was, a shock to an already battled and sort of, I think the word is besieged community from forces within the country. And it was a very difficult time in order to get both communities to coexist. But that's the value of building a very strong holding environment where diversity is seen as something that's a collective responsibility. And when people realize the power of having more and more people, then that's where we succeeded in getting this community to work together. In terms of class and income, the overwhelming majority of Helem's members are from the working class and from lower income groups. And this just goes to show you that it's people that actually have a lot to lose that fight the most. One of the things that I always say is that unfortunately, as soon as Helem worked on stopping all of police raids to gay bars, we lost like 70% of the people that used to come to our protests because the reason for them going was particularly that. And our work is firmly rooted in social and economic rights, and in the fact that one of the things that we concentrate most on in Helem is labor law reform and workplace equality and capacity development particularly. We stopped working on decriminalization 3 years ago because it's not a priority, and I can talk about that more in detail if anybody's interested. Closest political allies. We've been flirted with constantly by members of the political elite. We haven't fallen for it. First of all, we definitely recognize that just because you're pro-LGBT, A, doesn't mean you're genuine, and B, doesn't mean that it lasts, and C, doesn't mean that you haven't committed atrocities and are at odds with other rights-based movements and other communities in this country. We take sort of the power and solidarity building that we've done very, very seriously. I think the word intersectionality is a very powerful, very serious word that we don't take lightly. I think a lot of people just throw that word around. When we try to work, and we're working towards through intersectionality, and we reflect it not just in our speech, but in our activities, in the alliances that we build, we're getting there. So we've started to build power with the disability rights movement, with the anti-racism movement, but we've got a long way to go before we can say we're intersectional. And I'm being incredibly honest about that because this is a very slow, cumbersome way. You're bringing together large communities that have experienced trauma and you're putting them together in a space. This is not easy, and it requires a lot of patience, a lot of courage, and a lot of compassion. And when it comes to the feminist movement, it is Helem is a organization that centers feminism. It is part of our DNA. This wasn't something that was always the case. I would say one thing, that Helem was the first time in history that LGBT people came together under one roof for a political purpose in the region. No one had any idea what to expect. And in the early formation days, we discovered notions such as misogyny in the LGBT community and the gaytriarchy and transphobia in the LGBT community. And Helem was a place which all of these interactions and relationships were observed by very young, very radical, very inexperienced activists that were trying to do what they thought was best. And the results sometimes were devastating. Good news is that this place has been a place of learning, and the scars of Helem are there to bear for everyone to learn. That's why, I'm very happy to say that, approximately 47% of our membership are women or women identified, and that we coordinate very closely and are a part of the feminist bloc in Lebanon. We are one of the organizers of the Women's March every single year. And this is, again, one of the commitments that we have in terms of becoming truly intersectional, not just us as a staff and as leadership, but this whole community that come to us, many of which do not have the privilege of being burned and scarred and therefore learned from that experience. So, but Helem is a place where that learning happens on a daily basis.
Wonderful. So everybody on the call, I encourage you, send me a note if you'd like to ask a question to Tarek. I'm going to call Pancho Mulongeni. Pancho.
Yes, hi. I'm in Namibia, and I have a brief question in the sake of time. I think many people are thinking it as well. You know, how do you relate to LGBT groups in the global north? And I think to start with your closest country, Israel, how do you relate with them, and how do you counter the sort of question that is just like, oh, we feel so sorry for you? How do you get them to feel they can do something rather than just to feel sympathy? Thank you.
All right, thank you for that question, Pancho. The honest answer is that there is no interaction at all with LGBT groups in Israel. Lebanon and Israel are countries that are technically at war, and therefore any sort of connection is not really present or there. I can speak to LGBT groups in the global north, in Europe and the United States, in which the relationship is often is mostly collaborative, but not necessarily even. Queer spaces have been, or sort of international queer spaces have been places of learning. And sometimes it is quite difficult in order for activists from the region in order to explain that it's not necessarily a linear form of progression in which some countries just happen to be behind and some countries happen to be in front. We need to really question all of the assumptions that what has worked in Europe and the United States might not necessarily work in our context. For example, some of the questions that I'm currently wrestling with is, change the laws, you change the behavior. Is that necessarily true in our part of the world? And what does the intellectual engagement with that question look like? What is the prerequisites that are there in terms of governance, in terms of institutions that allow that particular formula to work in the United States and maybe not work in a place like Lebanon? Lebanon is unique, I'll admit, because we don't have a Supreme Court. So any laws that need to be changed in Parliament, which means it's a 100% political process. When you really think about it, even if you were to decriminalize in a place like Lebanon, people aren't being arrested because they violate Article 534, which criminalizes unnatural sex acts. People are being arrested because of what they look like, because of how they're walking on the street, and the police officer doesn't like the way they look or how they walk or what kind of what they're wearing. So it's a violation of their freedom of expression, not their violation first and foremost, before we get to violations of bodily integrity, etc. Another issue is the metrics of what constitutes success. Is it more laws and protections that constitute success or progress in this part of the world? When in places like the US, it's relatively much easier for somebody queer to leave, for example, from one city to another, where that narrative of individuality, whereby if you're not accepted in this community, you can be yourself and be accepted in another community. That's not really how it works in our part of the world, especially in a country this small, where everybody knows everybody. And instead of thinking of family dynamics and of tribal dynamics as necessarily a hindrance to rights and equality and inclusion and acceptance, have we intellectually engaged with this problem to think whether we can leverage these ties, leverage what we can see that's already there in our cultures in order to bring about equality and inclusion? I don't know. And the reason why I don't know is because there isn't enough data. There isn't enough people working on this. There's barely any ethnographies of queer people in the region, certainly not by Arab scholars and certainly not in Arabic. Most of what we read as activists in the region is written by non-Middle Eastern scholars, or if they are Middle Eastern scholars, they're written in English and almost bizarrely written with a Western audience, Western academic elite audience in mind. And I had the privilege of 2 years being in grad school to read theory. I can guarantee you no activist on the ground in the region has a moment to read theory or articles or, or ponder, what the applicability of Foucault or any of the others of other thinkers on our work. But I did, and I came back, and I was very sad to report that I found none of it useful in me creating strategies that actually solve public problems on the ground. The question we ask at Helem isn't how do we change institutions in order for them to become more inclusive. The question we ask is how do we improve the lives of people? Because that is the only question that you can ask in places in the world where you can't necessarily rely on institutions, where laws aren't necessarily a byproduct of a process that centers citizens and centers democracy. So I came back and I read all of these art, and they sound great, theoretically very sound. And you come back and you realize, oh my God, they don't know anything about what's going on. We don't know how queer women in rural Egypt relate to one another. We don't know how queer people in Saudi Arabia talk and how they form relationships, or in Yemen, or in the Gulf. A country that is incredibly useful and very interesting to watch right now is Kuwait. 2 months ago, a group of Kuwaiti activists brazenly marched up to the Palace of Justice and demanded that they register an LGBT rights organization. My jaw dropped to the floor. I couldn't believe the chutzpah, in doing that. And it's going on all over the region. It's just no one is really writing about it. People are more obsessed with this sort of a post-colonial lens looking at the region that has, been very prevalent for the past decade. And as much as it has contributed to our knowledge and contributed to the conversations, I believe it's, just one part of a gigantic body of work that has yet to be discovered. We need to support scholars and academics working on gender and sexuality in the region that write and publish in Arabic. Most of our language is an Arabized version of French and English to refer to ourselves. When we say queer communities in Lebanon, we say al-mujtama' al-queeri. We actually use the word queer. And what's that word to the vast majority of people living in the region? It doesn't mean anything. And it further contributes to seeing us as an isolated and sort of sequestered group that is subservient to Western interests or just a Western phenomenon. There's a reason why the MP called it a gay, what was it? The phenomenon of gays. Gays are phenomenal sometimes, but what the hell does that mean? And the fact that we're seen as a phenomenon means that we're gonna pass at some point because phenomenons fade. And that's not the case. So we really need to start looking at what's going on here before we start, making assumptions and trying to impose or trying to, even very generously suggest and support ways of liberation that might not work and might lead to more harm, or at best, keep things the way they are.
And I did send you some questions before, and we talked a little bit about this question about what should academic scholars be doing? What should they be asking? How should they be studying? And it seems like what you're saying to us is that we really have this dearth of indigenous Arab scholars working on these questions. And that probably is the chief challenge to understanding right now, because language, cultural, specificity isn't there. Let me take a question from Liz Barker.
Hi, hello Tarek, and please give my regards to Georges, because Give Out, my charity, funded Helem, and we did a little seminar with him during Pride. So thank you very much for that.
Well,
I want to, thinking about what you're saying, and as somebody who's long looked at places like Lebanon and Egypt as the more liberal countries within the region, and at the lack of progress towards equality, I wonder what you think would be appropriate strategy for you and for Lebanon. Rather than being something that is based on notions of human rights, which have largely been articulated in using Western language, as you say, whether or not really a very hard-nosed focused on economic liberation for LGBT people might be more appropriate, and if it is, what is it that we should be doing from outside to support that?
Thank you, Liz, not just for supporting Helen, but also for that question, because I think you hit the nail right on the head. And my answer to you is these are the questions that I'm trying to think about as much as possible. Like, what does effective, impactful, sustainable change look like in a place like Lebanon? And I can tell you that right now, let's just pretend COVID didn't happen, and let's just pretend that we're going to emerge from this socioeconomic crisis limping but still alive. I can tell you two things that I think are the most promising. Number one, engaging in a development framework rather than purely human rights framework is definitely one piece of the puzzle that I am exploring very, very seriously. And we're doing it in a way that isn't necessarily either or. That's why we're focusing so much on labor rights and economic empowerment. There's the obvious that, the more you economically empower people, the less reliant they are on services of NGOs, the more they're able to afford all of these issues that they actually lack. But we have been, for a while looking at solving this problem systematically and trying to map out who are the different actors in this system and what is it that we're really trying to change. And what we're really trying to change is values. We're not looking for a technical solution. We're not looking for, a ragtag group of activists that are going to go to the Supreme Court and change a law, and all of a sudden, boom, bam, boom, we've got equality. You have a very difficult, chronic public problem. And changing values means engaging in different parts of the system. Now, what we're working with, which is labor rights, is simultaneously approaching labor reform as well as workplace equality at the same time. Because we recognize that the private sector is a very powerful agent for change in a place like Lebanon, but at the same time, it cannot be held unchecked. And there needs to be a balance with labor reform as well as workplace equality. And in order to really bring that circle to a close, make sure that queer people are actually viable and are able to compete in today's job market. This is definitely one of the issues that we're trying to explore. The other is not necessarily looking at government and institutions as a vehicle through which equality is reached. We're a grassroots organization, we're a community-based organization, and we have adopted that approach to great success with many parts of the system that we're looking at. For example, the judiciary. Lebanon now has 8 landmark decisions ever since the first one in 2012, in which judges have refused to criminalize LGBT people under the penal code. And it's really, 8 sounds like a small number, but it's a huge deal in our part of the world. And almost all of those were Helem cases, all of the appeals courts, and as well as the initial ones that started the whole thing. And the way we achieved that wasn't, through coercion, or wasn't through traditional naming and shaming tactics. It was through recognizing that we needed to change the jurisprudence around gender and sexuality from the bottom up within the judiciary. So we worked lawyer by lawyer, judge by judge, law student by law student for years, trying to introduce not just what gender and sexuality fits into how judges think about our community, but what is the role of the judge in safeguarding society? And that's what made it work. That's why we're now seeing exponential number of lawyers actually taking on cases to defend LGBT people. When I first started 10 years ago, there were only 2. Now there are more than 100. So looking at that sort of tactic is really important. 3 is to also leverage geopolitical realities and to understand that, for example, if Lebanon right now is going through a particularly economically difficult times, it's about time to start arguing just how stupid it is not to allow everybody, all citizens, to be able to work equally and freely in order to be able to support the growth of the economy. So these kinds of approaches have been somewhat taboo in the history of the movement in Lebanon, particularly in Helem, which is a place that was and still to a large extent very radical in terms of how it looks at change and how it looks at particularly sort of solutions to economic problems. But strategy and what works and how to navigate that is something that we, and I think about every day. Every day I think, like, if I do take this decision, if we do decide to go down that route, are we alienating our community? Are we doing an unethical decision? Or is this going to lead to a far more better outcome later? And we just have to hold steady for the time being in order for things to balance out. So I can't tell you I have the answer yet. I can tell you that this is exactly what we're discovering day by day. And Helem is sadly one of the few places in which these conversations and these questions are being asked. And this sort of thought process and head scratching is happening. Because as I said, sadly, much of the academic output out there does not answer that particular question. It tells me that the reason why I'm oppressed is because the French introduced a law that to my country that criminalized me, and then the rest of the global north continued that trajectory through imperialism. I know that. I really know, I feel it, I know that every day. So what am I going to do about it? And really looking forward to more data and more people thinking with me and with others in this region on solving that question, that problem, sorry.
I'm going to close with another question about strategy. And it's the sort of big issue of the potential difference between Europe and North America and the Middle East and the Arab world. In that in Europe and North America, the credo of coming out has driven so much. The credo of being out and proud and visible to your neighbors and your family members, and the assimilation and normalization of working next to your colleague who suddenly happens to be gay, and your homophobia is lessened because you know them. Obviously, this is not something that we know a great deal about in academic terms, but what's your gut feeling? Does coming out matter, drive everything, change values in Lebanon? Is it a strategy that should be pushed as it was pushed in North America?
Thank you for raising that. I love that question. And because Helem has historically been accused of prioritizing visibility and coming out as a tactic, which a lot of people have questioned whether that is A, effective, and B, ethical, really. Knowing that we've never dealt, like as an organization, outed someone, against their will, but prioritized visibility and have at some points in our long history have demanded visibility of people being part of our organization. So that's a really interesting question. Do I agree that visibility and coming out actually contributes to more understanding, less mythology, more information, and therefore helps chip away at the ignorance and homophobia? Yes, absolutely. But one of the questions that I discovered when I came back was that, okay, we want to come out, but then come out as what? That question will really, stop you, because how do LGBT people, if you can even call them that, identify in this part of the world, and what exactly are they coming out as? And you find out that this is an incredibly layered and very complex question to answer, because many of our communities are not just, pure communities that have been unsullied by Western intervention or unsullied by globalization. Globalization has happened, and you find a massive diversity in Lebanese and in Arab urban and rural spaces and how queer people identify. Many people identify as LGBTQ, whatever the acronym is or is going to be. And many people completely don't even recognize or understand or subscribe to any of these identifiers. Many people don't even think it's a question of identity to begin with. So unfortunately, in our history, there's been a raging debate over what should we choose as people, as queer people living in this part of the world. And a lot of people have a lot of opinions on it. And what I always remember is that people have agency to identify the way that they want. You know, just because a certain sort of system of identification originated in the West does not make it any less legitimate in our part of the world. But at the same time, it shouldn't be obscuring other equally legitimate forms of identifying or non-identifying. The rainbow flag is another sort of a manifestation of this dynamic. You know, yes, the rainbow flag was designed by a white, old, cis gay man in San Francisco back in, what is it, 50s or the 60s?
70s.
But 70s, yeah, sorry. I should brush up on my San Francisco history.
Gilbert Baker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he passed away recently, unfortunately, and left a great legacy. But, you know, they did raise the rainbow flag in that concert in Egypt. So what kind of local political significance did that rainbow flag automatically gain in being raised by Sarah Hijazi herself, a communist, queer, you know, woman on Egyptian soil? So this is just one of the questions that, you know, I'm very excited. People that are much smarter than me, people that are much more learned, people that are much more academically grounded would answering using ethnographies and data and actually spending time in the region, learning the language, speaking the language, and you know, even studying the effect of language on identity and vice versa. So does coming out help? Yes. But that is the tip of the iceberg of answering this sort of cornucopia of question that it leads to.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I really want to thank you, Tarek, and everybody for joining us. And if people on the call don't know Helem's work or Tarek's work, I would encourage them to make themselves aware. It is, to me, consistently inspiring, not just in the courage, but also the nuance and the sensitivity of the work of the organization and Tarek's work as well. So I am always as soon as pandemic's over, I'm getting on a plane and coming back to Beirut because it is one of the best places to party and learn. And I would ask you all to pay attention to the work in the Middle East and especially Helem in Lebanon. So thank you, Tarek, and we wish you well with these very difficult times and hope you and family and friends are all safe and well. I should let you know that next week we have Sean Howell, who is from Hornet and the LGBT Foundation. He's been doing some interesting large survey work, and their latest report showed an American constituency of, yes, 7 million LGBT people, but 6 million Americans who identified as fluid in some way. 13 million people identifying a much larger sexually orientated fluid constituency who didn't necessarily say they were L or G or B or Q or T, but they said that they were sexually on the scale as fluid. And he'll be talking about applying some of that research to politics and economics and other things. So thank you all for joining us. I should also let you know that we're going to continue this through the autumn, fall. We have a great lineup of added speakers. Take a look at the website. We have our first speaker from Moscow talking about LGBTQ life in Russia. We're going to be talking to Andrea Jenkins, the Minneapolis Vice President, City Council, the first Black trans woman elected in America. I'm going to be talking to some fabulous academics studying politics in the UK, in America, and elsewhere as well. So thank you, Tarek. Thank you all for joining us. And we shall reconvene when the pandemic is over and we can all have drinks. Okay.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.